Burkina Faso just joined the nuclear club, and the West is terrified. Yes, you heard that right. A country once dismissed as too poor, too unstable, too insignificant has just signed a $56 billion agreement that may upend the global balance of power forever. It happened quietly in a high-security summit in New Delhi. No parades, no breaking news banners, just one photo. Ibrahim Traoré holding a piece of uranium, shaking hands with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But behind that handshake was an earthquake. For the first time in modern history, an African nation is not asking for energy. It's building it. Nuclear energy, 4 advanced reactors, a complete domestic fuel cycle, a nuclear technical university, and a training program for 10,000 African engineers. The room fell silent, not out of respect, but out of fear. Because this is not just electricity. This is the kind of power that builds empires. The power that runs aluminum smelters, steel factories, and supercomputers. The power that separates raw material exporters from industrial superpowers. And now, the question no one dares to answer. If Africa is capable of mastering the atom, why was it kept in the dark for 70 years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Is this the dawn of Africa's atomic age, or the beginning of something even bigger? And if you want more stories they never want you to hear, subscribe now, because what's coming next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew. $56 billion that changed the game. Burkina Faso didn't walk into the nuclear age quietly. It came with a blueprint so ambitious, so precise, it forced the world to stop laughing and start watching. The agreement with India is not some symbolic gesture. It is $56 billion of cold, calculated strategy. Not aid, not loans, not foreign-run facilities with African faces on the brochures. This is full-spectrum partnership, start to finish. Technology, education, infrastructure, and most importantly, control. Let's break it down. $20 billion for 4 next-generation nuclear reactors, each producing 1,200 megawatts. Together, that's more than Burkina Faso's entire current energy output, doubled. And it's not just enough to power homes. It's enough to power steel foundries, data centers, advanced manufacturing hubs. $15 billion goes to nuclear fuel processing. For the first time, uranium mined in Africa will be refined, enriched, and fabricated on African soil. That means the entire uranium value chain, from raw rock to reactor core, stays in Africa. No more shipping it to Europe. No more asking permission. $8 billion will build Africa's most advanced nuclear university in Ouagadougou, a continental center to train scientists, engineers, reactor operators, safety inspectors, all taught by Indian nuclear specialists until African experts take over. Within a generation, African nuclear science will be born and raised at home. $6 billion is allocated for safety and waste management, a direct challenge to Western accusations that Africans can't be trusted with nuclear technology. Traoré didn't just accept international standards. He set out to exceed them. The rest funds transmission infrastructure, research labs, regulatory frameworks, a complete atomic ecosystem. This is not improvisation. This is industrial war planning. And it comes with a bigger goal, not just electricity, but sovereignty, because this isn't about reactors. It's about leverage. With this infrastructure, Burkina Faso can export surplus electricity to Mali, Niger, Ghana, maybe even Nigeria. That means revenue, influence, and bargaining power. Imagine the Sahel no longer begging for investment, but selling power at market rates. And this terrifies the old order, because for 70 years, uranium moved one way, Out. African soil. Western reactors. African labor. Western light bulbs. But that pipeline is about to reverse. India gets long-term uranium contracts, yes, but only under mutual terms. Complete technology transfer. No colonial clauses. No veto power. No external control. And here's the wild card. Once this model works in Burkina Faso, it can replicate. Kenya is watching. Nigeria is already in talks. South Africa sees a partner, not a competitor. This deal doesn't just light up homes, it ignites minds. Young engineers who once dreamed of leaving Africa are now staying to study nuclear physics in Ouagadougou. For the first time, a 19-year-old from Ouahigouya can earn a degree in atomic engineering without setting foot in Europe. What Ibrahim Traoré is building isn't just a grid, it's a generation. But bold moves invite bold enemies. Within 48 hours of the signing, reports surfaced of diplomatic calls to New Delhi from Washington, Paris, even Berlin. Suggestions, recommendations, veiled threats. Western media began pushing a new narrative. Is Africa ready for nuclear? As if the question wasn't already answered. What they fear isn't safety. What they fear is proof. Proof that Africa can master the atom. Proof that the monopoly is broken. Proof that no continent is forever meant to kneel. And that brings us to you, the viewer. We've seen revolutions in the past, some built with slogans, others with bullets. But what do we call this? A revolution powered by uranium, by engineers instead of generals, by classrooms instead of camps. Here's the question they don't want you to ask. If Burkina Faso can build a nuclear future, what's stopping everyone else? Tell us what you think below. Is this Africa's turning point, or just the first domino to fall? When the world began to fear a nuclear Burkina Faso, no one in the global power circles expected that a landlocked, impoverished African nation could shake the geopolitical foundation of the world with a single signature. But that's exactly what happened when Ibrahim Traoré signed the $56 billion nuclear agreement. Within 24 hours, the phones started ringing in New Delhi, Washington, Paris, Brussels, Berlin, not to offer congratulations, but to interfere. In France, emergency meetings were held at the Élysée Palace. President Macron was briefed that the entire French nuclear strategy in Africa might collapse because of a single handshake in Burkina Faso. For decades, French companies mined uranium from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, then shipped it to Europe to power their reactors. Paris glowed. Ouagadougou stayed dark. Now, with that same uranium being processed and consumed on African soil, France's strategic lifeline was hemorrhaging. This was no longer about trade. This was about losing control. France quickly moved to pressure India, threatening to cancel arms deals, cut aid, stall international treaties. French media ran coordinated headlines. Burkina Faso is not ready for nuclear technology. The risk of dangerous tech spreading in an unstable continent. But behind the words was something else. Not concern for Africa's safety, but fear that Africa had learned to stand on its own. The United States responded more subtly, but just as decisively. The Pentagon voiced proliferation concerns. The State Department suggested alternatives: solar, wind, natural gas, anything but nuclear. No mention that solar disappears with clouds, or that gas comes with decades of dependency and price volatility. Just one message: nuclear is too much. But too much for whom? For the people of Dori, who have never seen 24/7 electricity in 60 years, or for a world that's used to Africa as a supplier of cheap raw materials. Nothing more. What they fear most is not technology. It's the precedent. Because if Burkina Faso can do this, Nigeria will ask, Why not us? Kenya will rethink its energy future. South Africa, already nuclear capable, will see a new kind of ally. And just like that, the old empire begins to crack. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, people are not paying attention to statements from Washington or Paris. They're watching power lines go up. They're applying for jobs at construction sites. University students are enrolling in nuclear science programs. Children are studying without candles. This isn't a revolution with bullets. It's a revolution with electricity. There has never been a precedent like this in modern history. A landlocked, impoverished African nation triggering emergency meetings in Western capitals simply because it dared to flip the switch. And that's what terrifies the global elite. Because when a poor nation builds nuclear power by itself, what stops the others from following? When the lights come on, everything changes. In Dori, a grandmother named Amina no longer cooks by firewood. For 60 years, she lived through promises. Colonial officials promised power. Independence leaders promised development. Foreign NGOs promised solar panels. None delivered. Now, for the first time in her life, she flips a switch and the lights stay on. Not for 2 hours. Not only when the sun is out, but 24/7. Reliable, clean, uninterrupted nuclear power. That moment, for Amina, means more than electricity. It means dignity. It means the promises are finally being kept, not by outsiders, but by Burkina Faso itself. In the dusty town of Gawa, a young mechanic named Sadu is finally expanding his garage. For years, he made do with 4 hours of electricity a day, enough to charge a battery, maybe run a drill, welding tools, diagnostic machines, out of reach. Now, with stable power, his garage becomes a hub, offering services never before available in the Sahel. He hires apprentices, installs solar chargers for e-bikes, trains others in EV repair. What was once a shack is now a center of mobility. Across the country, hospitals that once performed surgeries by flashlight are getting CT scanners, MRIs, and sterilization labs. Rural clinics once cut off from the grid are receiving steady power via new transmission lines. Vaccines that spoiled due to lack of refrigeration are now stored safely. Emergency operations no longer wait for a generator to start. And this is only the beginning, because nuclear power isn't just changing lives, it's changing how Burkina Faso sees itself. For the first time, the country has something other nations want, not just minerals, but knowledge. Indian engineers are training a new generation of nuclear experts in Ouagadougou. By the thousands, young students are lining up for admissions, not to leave for Europe, but to build here. Politically, Ibrahim Traoré's popularity has skyrocketed, not because of slogans, but because of results. Villages that were once forgotten are being wired. Young people once bound for migration routes are now entering technical schools. Women like Amina now vote not based on promises, but on delivery. The state, once seen as a bureaucratic ghost, is becoming real again, delivering energy, jobs, and security. And with every new reactor built, every university launched, every home electrified, Burkina Faso's international standing rises. It is no longer the country of instability. It is now the nation that did what others said was impossible. But here's the real shift. Before, Burkina Faso was known for insurgency. Now, it is known for infrastructure. Before, it was seen as dependent. Now, it is a model. And across Africa, leaders are paying attention. From Nairobi to Lagos, presidents are asking, if Burkina Faso can bring nuclear power to villages, what are we waiting for? So, we ask you, what does it really mean for a country to rise, not by war, but by wiring its people to power? Leave your thoughts below. Because this is not just an African story, it's a human one. Why Washington is watching closely. At first, the headlines barely noticed it. Just another African summit. Just another bilateral deal. But in Pentagon briefing rooms and in back channels at the State Department, something shifted. Burkina Faso's $56 billion nuclear agreement wasn't just news. It was a wake-up call. Because nuclear power is not just about electrons. It's about alignment. And what Washington saw was this. India, a rising Asian power, just secured uranium access and geopolitical trust in the very heart of West Africa, without American involvement. That's not just economic competition, that's strategic displacement. The United States has long framed its engagement in Africa as a mix of security support, democracy promotion, and humanitarian aid. But in that equation, energy, especially advanced energy, was never central. Now it has to be. Because once Burkina Faso masters nuclear infrastructure, it no longer needs diesel shipments. It doesn't need aid packages for solar panels. It doesn't need lectures about governance in exchange for power plants. It has power, literal and metaphorical. And with that power comes a new posture in global politics. France is losing influence fastest. For decades, Francophone Africa relied on Paris for development, defense, and diplomacy. But France offered dependence, not development. Now, as Burkina Faso and India sign deals of technological sovereignty, the French model looks outdated and exposed. Russia, watching from the sidelines, sees opportunity. They've long sought to expand their state-run nuclear export program through Rosatom. But India moved faster with better terms and more respect. Even China, with its Belt and Road infrastructure campaigns, is taking notes. Because this wasn't just hard infrastructure. This was soft power, won not through money, but through trust. Burkina Faso chose a partner that offered respect, not rescue. India didn't arrive with soldiers. They arrived with scientists. And that makes all the difference. In global forums, at the UN, the African Union, even at G20 summits, the very presence of nuclear capability changes the conversation. A nation that splits atoms is no longer seen as a passive recipient. It is a participant. And with every announcement, every satellite image of construction sites in Ouagadougou, the message to the world becomes clearer. Africa is not waiting anymore. Washington must now decide. Will it cling to outdated assumptions about Africa's readiness? Or will it engage with the continent as it truly is, ambitious, strategic, and rising? Because when a country like Burkina Faso builds reactors instead of refugee camps, it doesn't just change its own destiny, it rearranges the global table. So, here's the question for American viewers. If the world's poorest nations are mastering the atom, can the U.S. afford to ignore them any longer? From one reactor to a continental revolution, the first reactor hasn't even gone online. And already, the world is watching. What Burkina Faso has done is not just build infrastructure, it has broken a ceiling. For decades, nuclear power was locked behind diplomatic walls and economic barriers. It belonged to the elite club, America, Russia, France, China, the UK. The rest of the world left to beg, borrow, or buy from the outside. Now, that club has a new applicant, and it didn't come with a golden invitation. It kicked down the door. The next steps are already in motion. Within 5 years, 4 reactors in operation. West Africa's first nuclear-powered grid. Within 10 years, African engineers running 100% of operations, an African consortium processing uranium for the entire region. Within 15 years, a full nuclear education system, primary to PhD, anchored in Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso becomes the training ground for Africa's atomic future. And in 20 years, the continent moves from fossil dependence to energy leadership. Africa, once energy-starved, becomes an energy exporter. But perhaps more important than electricity is what comes with it: confidence, technical mastery, geopolitical leverage. Because when you split the atom, you also split the script. You stop being cast as the victim. You start writing your own narrative, and that narrative is spreading. Kenya has already requested consultations. Nigeria is assessing feasibility. South Africa sees an opportunity for continental alignment. A new future is forming, one where African uranium stays in African reactors, one where energy fuels not just light bulbs, but steel mills, medical research, and aerospace labs. This is no longer about Burkina Faso alone. It is about the first nation that said, "We're not waiting for permission anymore." So the question is, who will be next? Who dares to follow the uranium trail into the future? The atom that changed everything. They thought Africa would always be behind, that the continent of deserts and dictators could never master atoms, that we would always beg for power, while exporting the fuel that powered others. But now, the uranium beneath African soil is no longer silent. It speaks, and it says, "We have waited long enough." This is more than a power project. This is a pivot in civilization. Burkina Faso did not just sign a nuclear deal. It shattered the myth that some nations are born to lead and others to follow. It proved that technological sovereignty is not a Western privilege. It is a choice. Because when you can split atoms, you can shape empires. You can build cities where there were none. You can educate scientists where there were only farmers. You can take your place at the table, not with a begging bowl, but with leverage. And that leverage has just begun to echo across the continent. Today, Burkina Faso. Tomorrow, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Senegal. One uranium deal today could become 10 reactors across Africa within a decade. And with each reactor, each megawatt, each graduate in nuclear physics, Africa steps forward. Not as a continent in crisis, but as a civilization in renaissance. For the West, this is not just a geopolitical shift. It is a test. Will they welcome a nuclear-powered Africa as a partner, or fight it as a threat? Because once the atom is unleashed, it doesn't go back in the ground. It changes everything. And you, watching this now, you're part of this moment. Because history isn't made in silence. It is made by those who ask questions, who share, comment, debate, and push conversations forward. So here's our final question for you. If Africa now holds the atom, what does the world do next? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to stay updated, because next week we're exposing the real story behind the French uranium empire and how it's collapsing faster than anyone thought.